The shocking discovery, under the bridge, in California. In the quiet pre-dawn hours on August 15, 2023, the all-too-familiar hum of the Los Angeles outskirts echoed faintly under a vacant overpass near the industrial part of the city. Charlie Henderson, a seasoned sanitation worker who had been clearing out illegal dump sites for nearly 2 decades, began his day as he always did, with muggy air clinging to his skin and the harsh scent of smog assaulting his senses. Tasked with cleaning up another stretch of neglected land under the Garrison Avenue Bridge, Charlie had seen it all over the years, from rusting car parts to mattresses marinated in motor oil, but nothing, not even his well-worn desensitization, could have prepared him for what he stumbled upon that morning. He had parked his dusty utility truck just a few feet from the site, pouring himself a weak coffee as he scanned the debris for anything that might require extra manpower. His gaze quickly settled on something odd, several lumpy, irregularly shaped structures scattered beneath the bridge. At first glance they appeared to be mounds of dried concrete, not entirely out of the ordinary for such a grimy locale. Another lazy contractor ditching their leftovers, Charlie muttered under his breath, annoyed by the inevitable hassle of removing what must have been construction waste. But as he stepped closer, something prickled at the back of his neck, a detail out of place. The thick slabs didn't all look uniform in composition. Some had jagged edges, others were smoother, resembling makeshift blocks rather than anything professionally mixed. The oddest part, however, was the smell. At first, it was faint, a sour hint carried on the breeze, but as Charlie moved closer, it overwhelmed him. It was a cloying, putrid odor that stirred an instinctive revulsion deep in his gut, the unmistakable stench of decay. His brow furrowed. Charlie wasn't the type to rattle easily, but the combination of that smell and the oppressive quiet beneath the bridge put him on edge. He decided to investigate further against the persistent urge in his mind telling him to turn around and leave. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck, its beam cutting through the early morning gloom, and approached the nearest concrete block. The structure's surface was chipped in places, exposing an uneven interior that had once been crudely smoothed over. Running his fingers over it, Charlie flinched when he spotted what seemed to be organic material protruding slightly from one of the cracks. Brown and indefinable, it looked unnerving against the pale gray of the concrete. His mind raced. Is that... He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. No, it couldn't be, could it? Refusing to jump to any macabre conclusions, he reached for a crowbar lying in the back of his truck. With several sharp pries, Charlie chipped away at the brittle edges of the block. The stink surged, almost physical in its intensity. One final blow broke off a significant chunk of the surface and his flashlight illuminated the unsettling truth beneath. What he saw through that fractured exterior froze him to the core. There, entangled within hardened cement, appeared to be a section of what looked terrifyingly like decomposing human flesh, dark and partially congealed. Jesus! What the hell? The words tumbled out of his mouth in a shaky exhale. His knees weakened underneath him as the realization sank in. It wasn't construction waste at all. Sweaty and trembling, Charlie staggered back to his truck, his sense of professional detachment obliterated. He immediately called 911, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. The operator's calm voice contrasted with the terror racing through his veins. "This is Charlie Henderson. I'm under Garrison Avenue Bridge, northeast Los Angeles. I think I just found a body. It's in concrete. Jesus, there might be more than one. You need to send someone here. Right now." By the time the first patrol car screeched to a halt on the nearby service road, flashing its red and blue lights in the dim morning haze, Charlie hadn't moved from the truck. He sat on the edge of the bumper, head in his hands, replaying what he had seen over and over. Officer Torres, the first responder at the scene, approached cautiously, her expression skeptical, yet professional. "Mr. Henderson?" she asked. "You called this in?" "Yeah," Charlie croaked, his voice hoarse. "You're going to want to take a look under there." His trembling hand motioned to the scattered concrete blocks. Torres adjusted her belt, approaching the site with another officer. Within moments, both of them were stepping back, radios already in their hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, we're at the Garrison Bridge. Request immediate backup, and a forensic team. We've located what seems to be multiple bodies encased in concrete. Proceeding to secure the scene." The underpass quickly filled with the chaotic energy of a crime scene. Squad cars lined up like funeral processions, their sirens finally silenced. Floodlights replaced the dim sunlight struggling through the smog. Yellow police tape popped and snapped in the slight breeze as it cordoned off the area. Investigators carefully photographed the blocks from every angle, while the forensic team donned gloves and respirators to examine the grotesque slabs. Charlie knew he had just uncovered something far bigger than he could comprehend, but as he gave his statement to Officer Torres, one chilling question kept repeating in his mind: who would go to such horrifying lengths to hide their crimes beneath the unassuming gray of cement, and why? The concrete blocks, holding a grisly secret. As dawn broke over the Garrison Avenue Bridge, the scene beneath the overpass morphed from eerie silence into a flurry of flashing lights, authoritative voices, and nervous energy. The smell of decay now hung thick in the air, blending sickeningly with the acrid stench of smog from the highway above. Officers and investigators, some seasoned, others fresh to the field, moved cautiously around the area, their shadows elongated beneath the harsh glare of floodlights that pierced the morning gloom. Detective Rachel Moore, a 12-year veteran of the LAPD Homicide Division, arrived at the scene shortly after the first 911 call. She stepped out of her unmarked car, heels lightly crunching the gravel. Her steel-gray eyes swept the scene. She didn't need to get too close to feel the tension radiating from the officers already at work. "What do we have here?" Rachel demanded, her voice brisk as she approached Officer Torres, who was directing a junior cop to cordon off the area with additional yellow tape. Torres flicked her flashlight toward the scattered concrete slabs. "Sanitation worker found them about an hour ago. Said he thought it was construction waste until he noticed the smell. Took a crowbar to one of them. And there's no better way to say it. It's bad, detective." Rachel felt her gut tighten. She stepped forward, raising a handkerchief to her nose as the now familiar stench of rot hit her. "How bad are we talking?" "Follow me." Torres led Rachel to the nearest block, the same one Charlie Henderson had partially chipped away at. Slumped against the truck a few feet away, Charlie sat with a disposable coffee cup trembling in his hands. Rachel crouched beside the concrete block, examining the cracks where bits of soft, decomposing material peeked through. The jagged edges exposed layers that were unmistakably flesh. Her experience in homicide told her what her instincts screamed loud and clear: there was nothing natural or accidental about this. "Jesus!" Rachel pulled back, standing upright and meeting Torres's eyes. "We're sure it's human?" Torres nodded grimly. "Forensics is still working to confirm, but, well, you know the smell." Rachel nodded silently as an uneasy chill crept up her spine. She turned to where the other officers were working under the bridge. 7 distinct concrete blocks lay scattered across the area like tombstones to a secret too dark to bury. Some were fully intact, while others had small cracks or broken corners. The meticulous yet crude nature of their creation sent a shiver of disbelief through Rachel. Whoever had done this hadn't just been desperate, they'd been deliberate. 7 blocks? She asked, gesturing toward the spread. "Yeah, 7, Torres said. All about the same size, too, like someone made them with molds or frames, and from what we can see so far, not all of them are fully sealed." She hesitated. There could be more bodies inside. Rachel felt the weight of the enormity of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She took a long, steadying breath. "All right, let's get these transported to forensics. They'll need to break them down completely, carefully document the contents." She paused. "Let's pray it stops at 7. Meanwhile, the forensic team on the scene worked delicately, gauging the density of the blocks and assessing how best to extract their secrets. Dr. Harold Lynn, one of the department's top criminal analysts, carefully recorded measurements and material observations from the block Charlie had cracked open. "Detective," Dr. Lynn called out. Rachel approached, tilting her head toward him in acknowledgement. "I've never seen this level of effort in a case like this before. The concrete, well, it's amateur work, but it's reinforced. Whoever did this wanted these things to last a long time." Rachel steeled herself, peering over his shoulder. "What about the contents? What are we dealing with?" Lynn hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "We've done a preliminary look at this block, and it does appear to contain soft tissue consistent with human remains. It's badly decomposed, so we'll need to use DNA and skeletal analysis for identification. It's messy in there, Detective. There's no way this wasn't a deliberate disposal." Rachel's stomach turned slightly, but years on the job kept her reactions in check. "And the other blocks?" Lynn motioned toward another slab that had hairline fractures at its edges. "From the weight and density alone, it's a high probability they all contain remains. We won't know how many, if the victims were whole or dismembered, until we break them apart." Dismembered. The word hung in Rachel's head like a dark cloud. Using concrete to hide a corpse was bad enough, but the idea of a killer cutting a body into segments to embed them within these blocks was chilling. This wasn't just murder, it was rage, premeditated and methodical, disguised in cement like a twisted form of artistry. She tapped her temple lightly, a habit from years of processing crime scenes. "So, Lynn, let's talk concrete," she said, needing to piece together every layer of the killer's methodical work. "Are we looking at someone who mixed this on site, or could they have transported it here?" Lynn pointed to remnants of mixed gravel and cement dust scattered near the blocks. "I'd put my money on, it was mixed right here under the bridge, but they weren't pros. The concrete's inconsistent. You see the texture? Some blocks are lighter and more porous, meaning less water was used, maybe even rushed. But what concerns me," he dragged his gloved hand over the chipped remains of one block, "this has been curing for at least a couple of months. Whoever left these here did this a while ago and probably never intended to come back." Rachel clenched her fists, frustration bubbling in her chest. Time was the enemy now. Months-old evidence meant the trail was far colder than she wanted it to be. A killer with that kind of dedication, working in isolation for hours or even days, wouldn't have gone unnoticed. Someone knew something, they just didn't realize the significance of what they saw. She turned back to Torres. "Did anyone talk to the sanitation worker yet? Henderson, right?" Torres gestured toward Charlie, who sat silently, staring at the dirt beneath his boots as if trying to erase the morning from his memory. Rachel approached him, crouching down to his level. "Hey Charlie, I'm Detective Moore, can I ask you a few questions?" Charlie nodded stiffly, his coffee barely touched. "I'm not sure what I can tell you, it's just so messed up." Rachel kept her tone gentle but firm. "I get it, but anything you remember could help us here. Did you notice anyone hanging around this place before today? Any vehicles, anything unusual?" Charlie shook his head. "No, I don't usually come this far out. This spot's been a dump for years. Sometimes scrappers come through looking for metal, but I've never seen something like this." His voice wavered. Rachel glanced back toward the chaos unfolding around the cement blocks as they were loaded onto trucks. "All right, Charlie, if you think of anything, even the smallest detail, let me know, okay? You did the right thing calling this in. We'll take it from here." She stood and walked back toward Lynn, who motioned her over to inspect yet another detail emerging from one of the blocks being carefully examined. Small strands of fabric embedded in one corner, clinging to the porous surface of the concrete like whispers of the lives it once held. Rachel folded her arms and muttered under her breath, "What kind of monster creates their own gravestones?" Her partner Torres caught her words. "Monsters who think they can bury the truth forever." The victims' identities. Back at the precinct, Detective Rachel Moore sat at her desk, a steaming cup of black coffee untouched beside her. Her laptop glowed softly in the dim office light as she scrolled through preliminary forensic reports. The results from the coroner's office were coming in slower than she'd like, but it was clear enough. The blocks under the bridge contained human remains. The next step was figuring out who they were. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. "Moore," she answered sharply. "Detective, it's Lynn." The familiar rasp of the forensics expert came through the line. "We've got preliminary results from the DNA samples. You might want to hear this." Rachel sat up straighter. "Go ahead, what have you got?" "Well," Lynn began, his tone cautious, "the DNA from Block 1 matches a male, late 50s to early 60s. We've also picked up some distinct features. He's got an old right femur fracture that healed poorly, likely from a significant accident. Block 3 contains the remains of a female, early 30s, petite frame. Both have distinct signs of blunt force trauma. It's not definitive yet, but fingerprints from the scene are giving us a name." Rachel grabbed a pen, jotting notes as fast as Lynn was speaking. "Who are we talking about, Lynn?" "The male appears to be Robert Carter," Lynn said grimly. "Construction contractor, reported missing about 5 months ago. And the woman, we believe she's Anna Lee. She was reported as missing around the same time." Rachel felt a peculiar blend of relief and dread. Relief that they were beginning to identify the victims. Dread at the weight of the questions that followed. "Robert Carter and Anna Lee," she repeated aloud. "What do we know about them?" "That's where it gets interesting," Lynn said. Rachel could almost hear him adjusting his glasses on the other end of the line. "Both of them lived together in a small rental property. And get this, neighbors reported seeing Carter and Lee together for years. They weren't married, but by all accounts they were more than close." "More than close?" Rachel echoed, tapping her pen against her desk. "Like business partners? Family members? Lovers?" "That, we don't know yet," Lynn admitted. What we do know is they disappeared within days of each other. The official reports claimed they packed up and left town, but clearly that's not what happened. Rachel exhaled slowly. All right, Lynn. Keep working and let me know as soon as you get anything else. I'm going to take a deeper dive into their background. 2 missing people, 2 bodies, and 5 months later, this is starting to look personal. After hanging up, Rachel tapped into LAPD's database to pull Carter and Lee's records. The profiles painted a picture of contrasting lives brought together by some unknown force. Robert Carter, 58, a blue-collar man who had worked in California's construction industry for decades. His file was littered with mentions of unpaid debts and legal disputes over small contracting jobs. One particular case caught Rachel's attention. A subcontractor had sued Carter 2 years ago, claiming he defaulted on almost $15,000 in wages for a project. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Still, it painted a picture of financial trouble. Carter wasn't exactly rolling in cash, Rachel muttered to herself as she scanned more bank charges linked to unpaid bills and defaulted loans. Not a lot of enemies, but plenty of creditors. Then her eyes moved to Anna Lee's profile. 31 years old, originally from Seattle. A seamstress by trade, she had moved to Los Angeles 3 years ago, and had been living paycheck to paycheck. Her employers described her as diligent but quiet, the kind of person who faded into the background. No known family in Los Angeles, no husband, no kids. She was practically a ghost outside work hours. "What's your angle, Anna?" Rachel murmured under her breath as she flipped through Anna's last digital trail. Mobile transactions, a few isolated withdrawals, and notably, no financial activity at all after February of this year. Just as Rachel was trying to piece together the life and connection these two people shared, her partner, Officer Torres, poked his head into the office. "Got a sec, detective?" "Sure," Rachel said, waving him in. She leaned back in her chair, stretching out her tense shoulders. "Let me guess, you've got something juicy." "Well, depends on what you call juicy," Torres said, dropping a manila folder on her desk. "This just came in. It's Carter's rental contract for the house he and Lee rented." Rachel flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the document. "So, Carter signed the lease. Nothing shocking there." "Yeah, but look at the emergency contact," Torres said, tapping the page. "It's his son, James Carter. Know anything about him?" Rachel frowned. "Not much so far, but I know Carter had some family. Let's pull up his son's file." Within minutes, the picture became clearer. James Carter, 28, was listed as the sole beneficiary in Carter's life insurance policy and emergency contact on every major financial document. That wasn't unusual, but what caught Rachel's attention was the series of small claims lawsuits attached to James's name in other states. Unpaid loans, disputes over personal loans, threats of eviction. It all painted James as a man racing one step ahead of his creditors. "You seeing this?" Rachel asked Torres, pointing to the screen. "Everywhere he's gone, trouble's followed. But here's the kicker. He vanished right around the same time his dad and Anna disappeared." "What are you thinking?" Torres asked, folding his arms. Rachel leaned forward, her fingers scrolling through another set of records. "James Carter has motive. He's neck-deep in debt, and his father's the insurance policy terminating on that debt. Add Anna Lee into the mix, someone who could have been a witness or collateral damage, and we've got ourselves a suspect worth chasing." Torres nodded. "Suspect or not, James fits the profile. The gambler, the owed money, maybe a family grudge. What's our next move?" Rachel closed the file and stood up. "Simple. We need to figure out where James Carter is, and we need to figure out how bad his relationship with Daddy really was." As the day stretched into the evening, Rachel couldn't shake the image of the silent, hardened bodies encased in cement. Whoever they had been in life, Robert Carter, the struggling contractor, Anna Lee, the quiet seamstress, they now represented unfinished questions. And at the center of it all was one name that stood out like a blot of ink. James Carter. "Where are you, James?" Rachel muttered under her breath, determined to find answers. The elusive suspect, the only family member. It was past midnight at the LAPD precinct, but Detective Rachel Moore wasn't even close to being done for the day. The vending machine coffee on her desk had long gone cold, and her eyes were strained from hours of squinting at files, surveillance footage, and public record databases. She couldn't shake the gut feeling that the key to this case revolved around one person, James Carter. "All right," Rachel said to herself, running her fingers through her hair before pushing back from her desk. "If James Carter is the son of Robert Carter, and the timing of his disappearance lines up with the victims' deaths, we've got to find a way to track him." Just then, her partner, Officer Torres, strode into the cramped office, holding a stack of papers. He was running on nothing but sheer determination at this point, not unlike Rachel. "Got something for you," he said, dropping the papers in front of her with a satisfied grin. "It's not everything, but it's a start." "What is this?" Rachel asked, flipping through the stack. "James Carter. Background, financial records, previous addresses, and get this. A pattern of employment and travel that's all over the damn map. He's been leaving breadcrumbs, detective. Shifty ones." Rachel leaned forward, instantly hooked. "Go on." "Okay, so this guy's a drifter," Torres explained, pointing at specific pages in the file. "He's bounced all over the western half of the United States since he turned 18. Nevada, Arizona, Utah, back here to California. Wherever he goes, he picks up these short-term construction gigs, odd jobs, no contracts, just cash under the table. Every time he burns through his welcome, whether it's unpaid rent or personal disputes, he packs up and leaves." Rachel hummed thoughtfully, flipping through the pages. No permanent residence, no ties, no steady job, and he hasn't been seen or logged anywhere since his father and Anna Lee went off the grid 5 months ago. "Exactly," Torres agreed, leaning back against her desk. "And then there's the money. James Carter's got a string of small claims lawsuits on his record. Unpaid personal loans, disputed debts. He's dodged any major criminal charges so far, but this guy's finances are in shambles." Rachel tapped her pen against the desk. "All right, let's talk motive. If Robert Carter was the sole policyholder on a decent life insurance payout, and James is named the beneficiary—" "Bingo," Torres interrupted. "That would be one hell of a motive." Rachel frowned deeply. "But life insurance payouts don't get handed over easily. They'd ask for a death certificate before paying out. And if Robert's body is stuffed in one of those cement blocks, James had no intention of reporting his death through legal means." "So he intended to disappear," Torres added. "Take whatever he could, drop off the grid, and hope no one dug deep enough to connect him to his dad's murder." Rachel sighed, leaning back in her chair as she tried to piece together James Carter's mental state. "Okay, so he's a guy with debt up to his eyeballs. He's angry at his dad for either not helping him or not paying him back. Maybe they're fighting over money and Anna gets caught in the crossfire, but he doesn't just kill his father and Anna, he takes it a step further. He encases them in cement, for God's sake. That's not desperation, that's premeditated and methodical." "Or psychotic," Torres offered grimly. "Does anyone normal really have the mindset to do that?" "Well, normal or not, we need to find him," Rachel said, snapping the file shut. Her voice was resolute. "Where was he last seen?" Torres leaned over her desk and pulled out a highlighted section of the report. "This is where it gets frustrating. James was last officially logged in Los Angeles 7 months ago. He was working as a foreman for a small contracting firm, but they fired him after only 3 weeks. He left his address on file as his father's rental property, the same house Robert and Anna were living in when they disappeared. After that, nothing. It's like the guy evaporated." Rachel cursed under her breath. "No social media, no credit card activity, no phone records?" "Nothing," Torres confirmed. "He's living off cash. No bank transactions since his disappearance, and I bet he knows better than to leave an online footprint." Rachel's mind raced. "All right, let's try another approach. James is a drifter, sure, but there's a pattern to these guys. They don't just disappear into thin air, they move to places where they fit in, places that won't ask too many questions. Start looking into short-term labor opportunities in nearby counties, construction crews, handyman jobs, under-the-table payments, anywhere someone like James could fly under the radar." "On it," Torres said, already heading for the door. Rachel returned her attention to the file in front of her. Page after page was filled with glimpses of a man who seemed perpetually lost, both physically and emotionally. James had dropped out of high school his junior year, the school citing chronic absenteeism. He'd never held a job for longer than 4 months. There were no photos of him as an adult, and reports from former employers painted him as quiet, introverted, but prone to sudden bursts of anger when pressed. Something in Rachel's gut told her this wasn't just about money. It couldn't be. There was a deeper resentment here, one that had festered over years. A few hours later, Torres burst back into the office, holding a printout. "You're not going to believe this," he began, slightly out of breath. "What do you have?" Rachel asked, standing to meet him. "A subcontractor in Bakersfield claims he hired a guy matching James Carter's description about 4 months ago. He was working on a demolition project, but guess what? He disappeared after just 1 week." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Any name? Did he leave anything behind?" "Just a name," Torres said, handing over the report. "He called himself Jake Connors. But the foreman recognized his photo when I emailed him James Carter's mugshot from public records." Rachel swore under her breath. "He's using aliases. How many names has he gone through at this point?" 3 that we know of: Jimmy Carter, Jake Connors, and even a plain old JC on a work roster up in Nevada, Torres said. But here's the kicker. The foreman says James spent a lot of time asking weird questions about cement mixing. He thought it was odd but didn't think much of it until now. Rachel's blood ran cold. Cement mixing? She repeated. Yep, Torres confirmed grimly. The guy was really curious about how long concrete takes to set, how to reinforce it without industrial equipment. That doesn't exactly scream innocent to me. Rachel grabbed her coat and keys. Call in backup. We're heading to Bakersfield. If James Carter thought he could walk away from this, he's about to learn otherwise. The search for James Carter had officially gone from a manhunt to a ticking time bomb. Rachel could feel it. He wouldn't stay invisible forever. And when they found him, she was determined he'd answer for what he'd done. This version dives into building the tension as James Carter becomes an increasingly ominous suspect, with clues pointing toward his guilt and psychological state. Let me know if there's anything you'd like adjusted. Clues about debts and family conflict. Detective Rachel Moore sat in the cramped conference room of the precinct, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Papers, photographs, and sticky notes were spread across the table in a chaotic yet purposeful arrangement. Centered in the middle was a photo of Robert Carter, his weathered face looking back at Rachel, almost daring her to uncover the truth about his life and death. Next to him was an image of his son, James Carter, with his perpetually weary eyes and a thin-lipped, reluctant smirk. All right, Rachel said, breaking the silence as she addressed her partner, Officer Torres. Let's put all the pieces together. What do we actually know about this father and son? What caused this level of tension between them? Torres leaned forward, tossing a folder onto the table. It's not pretty, Detective. Robert Carter wasn't exactly Father of the Year material. He had a long history of financial trouble, unpaid debts, legal disputes over contracting jobs that went south, and even a few incidents of wage disputes with employees. That's how he worked. Take on a big project, pull in other contractors, and somehow fail to pay most of them. The lawsuits never ended in his favor, but the damages he owed never seemed to get paid either. Rachel scanned a highlighted report Torres had pulled. All right, so Robert wasn't winning any popularity contests, but where does James fall into all this? That's where it gets interesting, Torres said, tapping a page. James wasn't just any estranged son. He had a financial arrangement with his old man, or at least, he thought he did. Torres handed Rachel a transcript from interviews conducted with some of Robert's acquaintances. Apparently, James had been borrowing money from Robert. I'm talking thousands of dollars over the past few years. To hear neighbors tell it, Robert lent it begrudgingly but kept promising he'd eventually help James and get back on track. Whatever that means. Rachel frowned as her eyes skimmed the text. And let me guess, Robert never saw those loans as anything formal. To him it's just, go make something of yourself, kid. But over time, James thought he owed him something more. Torres nodded. Exactly. From what we're piecing together, James started getting desperate as his debts piled up. He borrowed from his dad to pay off other debts, but with Robert's own financial troubles, it was a toxic cycle. Neighbors say they'd heard shouting matches between the two whenever James visited, sometimes about money, sometimes about family issues, but mostly about the money. Rachel leaned back, the thin metal chair creaking beneath her. Sounds like fuel for resentment. You've got one man who's drowning in his own financial failures, and you've got his son trying to stay one step ahead of his creditors, thinking his father has more to give. It's a ticking bomb. There's more, Torres said, flipping through another report. A bartender in East Hollywood recognized James from a photo. Said James came into the bar a few times last year, drunk off his ass, ranting about his father. The bartender says James called his dad a pathetic bastard, who owed him everything but couldn't even give him hope. That's heavy, Rachel muttered, pressing her temple. So James thought his dad owed him, not just money but an escape from the mess he'd created for himself. Torres leaned forward. It gets worse. Neighbors remember seeing James and Robert in a huge screaming match outside the rental property about 6 months ago, just weeks before the disappearances. Apparently James started threatening to call the police on Robert, though it's unclear why. No police report ever got filed, but one woman remembers hearing James yell something about paying his debt one way or another. Rachel's eyes narrowed. That's dark. Paying his debt could mean anything, from actually demanding cold, hard cash to something way more violent. Torres nodded. Right. And get this, a few of Annalee's co-workers mentioned seeing James Carter at least twice. He'd show up at her workplace angry and insistent about talking to her. One co-worker even overheard James saying, "If you're part of this, then you're gonna regret it too." It's clear whatever tension existed between Robert and James, Anna became tangled in it, maybe as a witness or someone who tried to step in. "That tracks," Rachel said grimly. Anna might have been a bystander caught in the crossfire. Maybe she tried to defend Robert or mediate between them, and James saw her as a liability. She stood and started pacing around the room. A detail in the file caught her eye. "Wait a second," Rachel said, picking up another document. "What's this about James taking out a payday loan right before his dad disappeared?" Torres glanced at the file. "Ah yeah, another piece of bad judgment from our guy. James went to one of those sketchy title loan places in Reseda, borrowed $3,000 against the title for an old truck. The payment terms were insane. He'd be drowning in interest within a month, but the timing's the key here. It lines up with Robert and Anna's disappearances." Rachel set the file down with a sharp thud. "So we've got substantial debts, explosive arguments, and a trail of shady financial decisions. Everything we're uncovering paints James as a guy backed into a corner, and in his mind his father is the obstacle, maybe even the cause of all his problems." Torres crossed his arms, his face grim. "Factor in Anna, and you've got someone in James who's spiraling. He sees his dad as the reason he's failing, and Anna as either a witness or an accomplice to Robert. If he thought eliminating both of them would solve his problems, well, we know what happened." Rachel nodded. "We're dealing with someone fueled by anger, desperation, and years of resentment. This isn't just about money, it's personal. James didn't just want to get rid of his debts. He wanted to crush the very people he blamed for his failures." "And stuffing them into concrete?" Torres said. "That's meticulous. He thought he could bury his guilt and his victims in one shot." Rachel tapped her fingers on the table. "We need to narrow this down. Any other records of contact or financial transactions that could tell us where James might be now?" Torres picked through the rest of the files. "Nothing definitive yet, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy with a well-thought-out plan. If he's still operating out of desperation, chances are he's going to slip up eventually." "Let's hope he does," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "Because right now, we know exactly what he's capable of when he feels cornered." Rachel glanced at the photos of Robert and James on the table, their family connection now fully enmeshed in the tangled web of hatred, betrayal, and greed. The next step in the investigation wasn't just finding James, it was uncovering whether there had ever been any chance of reconciliation, or if James had written that off long ago along with his father's life. The pursuit of James Carter. The clock on Detective Rachel Moore's desk ticked past 3 a.m., but the pursuit of James Carter was just picking up steam. Her office had become a war room, papers scattered everywhere, a large corkboard now littered with maps and locations, red strings stretched across pins that marked James's last known addresses, his shady places of work, and the breadcrumbs he'd unknowingly left behind. A cold coffee cup sat forgotten next to her keyboard as she pored over the fragments of his life, trying to see the chain that linked his movements. "All right," Rachel muttered, mostly to herself but loud enough to catch the attention of Officer Torres sitting across the room. "What do we know about him? Give me everything we've got, start to finish." Torres leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "James Carter, the drifter kid who can't keep his head above water. Like we know the guy's been living paycheck to paycheck, hopping through construction gigs and short-term labor jobs. Every time he skips town he leaves a mess, unpaid rent, disputes over tools, stolen equipment. He might be trying to run from something or everyone, but he's still using the same playbook." Rachel nodded, marking points on the map in front of her. His last official paycheck had been from Bakersfield, California, 4 months ago. "So what's he doing now? A guy like him doesn't just sit still." "That's the thing," Torres chimed in, flipping through reports. "Construction equipment companies in Nevada have sent us complaints about missing tools. A handyman in Arizona mentioned someone named Jake Connors borrowing his cement mixer and vanishing. Guess what? That alias keeps popping up." Rachel's pen stilled in her hand. "Every single sighting, it's him." She looked over at Torres, her gray eyes sharp. "Why cement? Everywhere he goes, it's tied to construction supplies, building sites. Nobody looks twice at a guy asking for concrete in a construction zone." "Either he's laying low or he's planning something worse," Torres added darkly. "Let's focus on patterns." Rachel circled a smattering of red dots across the map. "He starts in California, ends up in Oregon and Nevada, then Arizona. But if you connect the time frames, it looks like he's avoiding predictable routes, jumping into small towns, barely staying long enough to leave a trace. Someone who's scared of getting caught doesn't pick places where law enforcement is thin on the ground, unless he knows how to stay invisible." She paused, staring at the crooked line his path created. "But he's not just running, Torres. He's a guy who doesn't just disappear into nature. He needs money, tools to survive. And until we find his new safe zone, all these towns are leading us in circles. Torres leaned over the table. I've called in a favor with an analyst in missing persons. They're tracking under-the-table labor markets in key southwest regions, desert towns outside Phoenix, construction zones near Vegas, migrant-plagued job listings from Utah. If James is anywhere, he's working off the books. Rachel tapped her pen against her teeth, piecing it together. Keep tracking employment records. What about motels? These guys stick to cash and no names, Torres. Run searches on manager complaints about unpaid stays, anywhere close to hardware stores or industrial sites. Torres grinned. Already ahead of you on it. 3 motel managers in New Mexico flagged similar complaints last month. One name came up twice, Jake Connors. Rachel's eyes darkened, the threads from years of investigative work tightening in her mind. He's circling his ego. This trail is a dead giveaway. He doesn't want to stray far from construction resources and concrete. He's trying to find the perfect surroundings to operate unnoticed. As the gears began turning, Rachel couldn't stop her pulse from quickening. James Carter was no beginner to hiding in plain sight, but every con artist and runaway left fingerprints on their choices. Torres, she said, spinning toward him. He's dropping clues. Not intentionally, but he's never had to run like this before. It's sloppy. Focus every resource we have on cement companies, welding yards, rental depots. I want every Jake Connors flagged within 500 miles. By the end of the week, investigators had combed through a mountain of information, sending out alerts to local precincts across 3 states. It was exhausting work, and the trail was at times agonizingly cold. Rachel spent sleepless nights, her head on the desk, puzzling over what James's next move might be. And then the call came. More, she answered, groggily but instantly alert. Detective, we've got a hit, Torres said, excitement crackling in his voice. A construction manager in Albuquerque just ID'd James Carter, or someone matching his photo. He's working under the name JC as part of a demolition crew. They've been gutting condemned properties on the east side of town. Rachel was already grabbing her coat. When did he last show up? This morning, Torres replied. Get this, he's been asking about transporting industrial cement. Manager let it slip that his crew's been renting mixers for longer-haul projects. It smells fishy, Rachel. Without hesitation, Rachel barked directives. Alert Albuquerque PD. Send me his location and any other team members working with him. We're moving now. The drive to New Mexico was relentless. Rachel barely blinked the entire way, her mind racing through all potential scenarios. What if James ran again? What if they got there too late? What if he was armed, desperate enough to harm someone else in his path? Desperation made people reckless, unpredictable, and James had already proven he was dangerous. Torres glanced at her from the driver's seat. You're quiet. You think he's gonna fight us? No, Rachel said after a moment of contemplation. He's got 2 options. Either he runs again while we're breathing down his neck, or he locks himself into some bunker of a workspace. Either way, it ends here. The precinct in Albuquerque had already set up a task force around James's last known worksite. The demolition zone was a sprawling wasteland of torn drywall, heavy-duty scaffolding, and dark hollowed-out rooms. Workers lingered nervously, having heard the murmurs of police involvement. Rachel stepped out of her vehicle, taking everything in, her instincts vibrating. Somewhere here, the man she had been chasing for months was working, or hiding. The site manager approached her, visibly tense. Miss Moore? The older man asked, his hard hat clutched awkwardly in his hands. That's me, Rachel replied. Where's your guy, JC? The man gestured toward an alcove far in the back of the site. That's where he starts most mornings. He's strange, you know. Doesn't talk much, always works extra hours by himself. We thought he was just a guy down on his luck. Never thought he'd, a killer. Rachel gave him a curt nod. Stay back and keep your workers out of harm's way. With Torres beside her, her Glock drawn, she made her way toward the far scaffolding. Cement powder dusted the air as machinery labored nearby, drowning out much of the background noise. Heart pounding but steady, Rachel surged forward. James Carter, she called out, her voice slicing through the din, commanding. This is Detective Rachel Moore, LAPD. We know who you are. Come out now. Hands where I can see them. The shadow behind the scaffolding froze. To be continued. The crime scene discovery. The house at 438 Willow Creek Road looked like the type of place that could tell 1,000 stories, none of them good. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel path, its paint peeling in large uneven patches, the front yard overgrown with weeds that swayed lazily in the autumn breeze. The windows, half covered with dirt stains, cast an eerie glare under the dusky sunlight. To any bystander it seemed like the quintessential abandoned rental, forgotten by time. But for Detective Rachel Moore, standing at the edge of the front lawn, it reeked of something far worse, secrets buried beneath layers of deceit and desperation. Rachel glanced over at Officer Torres, who was standing just behind her, clipboard in one hand, flashlight in the other. "This the place?" she asked, her voice quiet but tense. Torres nodded, flipping through his notes. Robert Carter and Anna Lee were last seen here. Neighbors reported loud arguments just weeks before their disappearance. And this rental? It's on record as the last official residence of James Carter. That's a trifecta of bad news. Rachel adjusted her gloves and nodded toward the team of forensic experts waiting by their van. "Let's go in. If this house has answers, it's about time it started talking." The front door creaked ominously as Rachel pushed it open, flashlight sweeping through the dimly lit interior. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching the beam of light. Stepping inside, the stale scent of mildew mixed with something far more troubling, faint but unmistakable, the metallic bite of dried blood. Rachel felt her stomach twist as she exchanged a glance with Torres. "Smell that?" she asked. "Yeah," he muttered, stepping cautiously into the room. "That's not from a leaky pipe." The living room was sparse, almost depressingly so. An old couch, its cushions sagging with age, sat in a corner, while a small coffee table bore the faded rings of too many coffee cups. But it wasn't the furniture that caught Rachel's attention, it was the floor. More specifically, the faint dark stains that trailed along the hardwood, almost as though someone had tried to clean them, but hadn't finished the job. Rachel crouched, running a gloved finger over one of the spots. "Blood," she said flatly. "Looks like someone tried to scrub it out, but they didn't do a good enough job." Torres leaned over her shoulder, shining his flashlight along the trail. "It leads toward the kitchen." "Of course it does," Rachel murmured, rising to her feet. She motioned for the team to follow as she moved into the next room. The kitchen was somehow even bleaker. Empty cabinets hung haphazardly on the walls, their doors slightly ajar as if left open in a rush. The sink was full of grime, and against one corner of the room sat what appeared to be an old, rust-coated mixer, the kind used for construction, not cooking. "Well, that's not supposed to be here," Torres remarked, his light fixed on the machine. Rachel approached it, her pulse quickening. "Construction equipment, in a kitchen. You see where I'm going with this?" Torres nodded grimly. "Let me guess, they weren't using it to mix cookie dough." Rachel leaned in closer, examining the splatters along the edges of the rusty bowl. It didn't take a detective's eye to know it wasn't just dirt. She tapped the side of the mixer with one finger. "Get a sample of this. We need to confirm, but if I had to guess, this thing didn't just mix concrete, it saw more than its fair share of blood." One of the forensic techs stepped forward, snapping on bright white gloves, as they began working to collect evidence. Rachel's attention, meanwhile, shifted to another corner of the room, where several neatly stacked wooden planks sat against the wall. "What do you think those are for?" Torres asked, following her gaze. Rachel inspected the wood, running her flashlight along its lengths. "Frames," she said after a moment, "or molds, more accurately. I'd be willing to bet these were used to shape the concrete blocks we pulled from under the bridge. These cuts are clean, precise. James Carter didn't just work construction, he learned how to make things last." "Like homemade tombs," Torres added darkly. The deeper they moved into the house, the clearer the story became. In one of the bedrooms they found more damning evidence, a stack of dusty used tools, hammers, crowbars, chisels. Some were stained with a dark residue that wasn't just rust. A forensic technician bagged each tool carefully, but it was Torres who spotted what might have been the most chilling clue. "Detective," he called, kneeling by the baseboard of the room, "you'll want to see this." Rachel crossed the room and looked down. Torres was pointing at a nearly imperceptible scratch along the wooden floor. At first it didn't seem like much, but as Rachel's eyes followed it, she realized it wasn't just one scratch. It was an entire series, trailing toward the center of the room. "Dragged something heavy," Rachel muttered. "Maybe the bodies." She straightened, glancing around the bedroom. James didn't just lose his temper one night and kill them. He planned this. He had the tools ready, the equipment. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was cold, calculated. Torres walked to the window, glancing at the overgrown yard outside. "And then he turns this house into a workshop for murder." Rachel nodded, her jaw tightening. "When was the last time neighbors reported seeing James here?" Torres checked his notes. "Roughly 5 months ago, same time Robert and Anna disappeared." The final piece of the puzzle came when Rachel descended into the basement. The air grew colder and damp as she stepped down the narrow wooden stairs, every creak punctuating the silence. The flashlight's beam caught something metallic at the edge of the room, another mixer, slightly larger, with dried concrete hardened along its base. "Look at this!" she called, pointing to what lay next to it. Torres stepped closer, his stomach sinking. Resting beside the mixer were several large sacks labeled Portland cement. The tops had been haphazardly torn open, the remnants of their contents spilling onto the floor. Nearby, thick gloves and empty water jugs sat discarded, as though someone had left in a hurry. And then there was the tarped area in the corner, something Torres didn't want to speculate about. As Rachel approached, she could see streaks of dried red along the edges of the tarp. She crouched, lifting it carefully, and revealed a thick wooden board, stained and scarred. She shone her light over it, her heart heavy with a grim certainty. "This was his workstation," she said quietly. "This is where it began." The evidence painted a harrowing picture. A man consumed with resentment, debts and rage, turning this unassuming home into a factory for murder. James Carter hadn't just killed, he'd engineered every step to ensure his victims vanished without a trace. But no craft, no matter how meticulous, could erase mistakes, and this house was a mistake that would haunt him forever. As Rachel emerged from the basement into the cool evening air, she paused at the front porch, the weight of the scene settling on her shoulders. "Torres," she said finally, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat, "make sure this place is sealed tight. We've got everything we need to bring him down." Torres nodded. "What's the next move?" Rachel glanced back at the shadowy house, now alight with the flashes of crime scene cameras. "We find James, and we remind him that no matter how hard you try to bury the truth, it always comes back to the surface." Testimonies from witnesses. The Albuquerque precinct was buzzing with low chatter as Detective Rachel Moore leafed through a pile of fresh statements. The testimonies, collected from various work sites and local businesses, were starting to pile up, each one painting a vivid picture of James Carter's increasingly erratic behavior leading up to his disappearance. Rachel took a sip of her coffee, her eyes flicking across the notes, pulling out details like tiny threads to weave a larger tapestry. Her partner Torres walked into the room, tossing another folder onto her desk. "Here," he said, his voice as tired as she felt. "Got a few more for you. This guy left more fingerprints than he probably realized." Rachel thumbed through the papers, her eyebrow raising at one report from a construction foreman in Albuquerque. "What is it with this guy and demolition sites?" she muttered aloud. Torres sat down across from her, folding his arms. "Anything good in there? Or are we still wading through the usual, he was quiet and weird stuff?" "Well," Rachel said, holding up the foreman's testimony, "this one's different. The guy claims James was obsessed with concrete, says he kept asking questions about how to mix it, how long it takes to set in different temperatures, and, get this, how to make it harder to break once it's cured." Torres let out a low whistle. "That doesn't exactly scream innocent curiosity, does it?" "Not even close," Rachel replied. She scanned further down the page. "The foreman also says James, Jake Connors at the time, worked extra hours alone, even after the crew clocked out. Says he caught him once at 3 a.m, dragging a wheelbarrow full of cement bags toward a side lot." "Side lot? What was he doing out there?" Torres leaned forward. Rachel shrugged. The foreman didn't ask. He thought it was weird but figured the guy was just some broke loner looking to pick up extra work. It wasn't until now, after seeing the news reports, that he realized just how suspicious it was. Rachel pulled out a second statement from a motel manager who had recognized James's mugshot. "Listen to this," she began, reading aloud in a measured tone. "The manager says James stayed at the Red Star Motel for about 2 weeks under another alias. Jim Carter. Says he always paid in cash, never let housekeeping in his room, and left the place in worse shape than anyone they'd ever seen." "What kind of worse shape are we talking?" Torres asked, leaning forward in his chair. "He left behind bags of concrete in the closet, traces of metal shavings in the sink, and, this is the kicker, several deep gouges in the room's wooden floors." Torres shook his head. "The guy doesn't know how to clean up after himself, does he?" Rachel smirked faintly. "Thankfully no. And then there's this part. The manager overheard James arguing with someone over the phone. The specific phrase they caught was, 'It has to stay hidden.' You said no one would find it." She set the paper down with a decisive tap. "That doesn't sound like a man who's innocent." Torres pulled out an additional witness statement they had received from a few of James's former co-workers. "A couple of these guys from another site in Tucson saw him a few months ago," Torres said. "This is where it gets unsettling. Two of the workers remember James talking about family problems. Rachel gave him a sharp look. Family problems, like what? One guy said James told him his father ruined his life, Torres explained, flipping through the testimony. Said he called his dad a thief, a liar. And, this is the direct quote, "If he won't pay me back in money, he'll pay me back another way." Rachel leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Another way. That's the second time we've heard a phrase like that. First it was with the neighbor outside their house, and now co-workers. It's starting to sound less figurative, more literal. That's not the worst of it, Torres said grimly, picking up another sheet. They also remember James mentioning someone named Anna, said she was always in the way and that he wished she'd just keep her mouth shut. Rachel's jaw tightened. Anna Lee, she whispered under her breath. He might have seen her as an accomplice to his dad's problems or someone sticking her nose into their fights. He didn't just resent his father, Anna too became a target. Their stack of leads was growing, but so was the picture of the man they were chasing. Rachel turned her attention to another local business owner, a hardware store clerk in Phoenix. This guy remembers James clear as day, she said, holding up the report. Says he came in twice in the same week and bought an absurd amount of cement mix, rebar, and chisels. He was apparently so nervous that he kept checking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was following him. Well, he was right to be nervous, Torres quipped. But why buy chisels for shaping concrete if you don't want it to break easily? Rachel smirked faintly. Because maybe you're breaking something else before sealing it up. Yeah, like a body. Torres frowned. This guy didn't just kill in desperation, Rachel. This was systematic. Every purchase, every question, he was plotting this out like some sick science experiment. She nodded. But you know what else it tells us? No matter how calculated he thought he was, he left a chain of witnesses behind. The foreman in Albuquerque, the motel manager in Phoenix, the hardware clerk. Glancing toward the corkboard, now peppered with threads connecting faces to statements, she added, "He's careful, but he's not invisible." The final statement they reviewed came from an unlikely source, a waitress at a 24-hour diner in a small town outside Las Cruces, New Mexico. Rachel held up the report as she spoke. The waitress says James, or as she knew him, Johnny Connor, was a regular for about 2 weeks. Always ate alone, barely spoke. But one night he'd had a little too much to drink, and started to vent. She says he talked about finally settling some debts and joked about being good at making things disappear. Torres let out a small laugh, dripping with disbelief. He practically confessed in a diner. What an idiot. Confident idiot, though, Rachel fired back. He probably thought she wouldn't think twice about it. Jokes like that don't raise alarms, until you're looking for a killer. Rachel leaned back, her mind spinning through the growing web of testimonies. Each one, on its own, seemed trivial. Half-remembered fragments of small interactions, but pieced together they painted a chilling portrait of a man whose every move spoke to guilt, resentment, and a warped sense of resolve. "He's left just enough of himself behind," Rachel said softly, almost as if to herself. "He thinks he's outsmarted everyone, but he's too reckless to stay in the shadows." Torres folded his arms, nodding in agreement. "So what's next? We've got witnesses, receipts for cement and tools, and verbal threats. How do we turn all of this into a net that catches him?" Rachel stood, pulling the latest testimonies together and pinning them onto the map on the corkboard. "We keep following his trail of mistakes until we're close enough that he can't run anymore. Eventually he'll slip, because now he knows we're after him. And when fear kicks in, that's when people like James make their biggest mistake." Her eyes were steady as she stared at the map, her determination nearly tangible. "He's running out of places to hide." The arrest of the suspect. It was just after dawn on September 8, 2023, when Detective Rachel Moore rolled into Houston, Texas. The sun climbed lazily over the city skyline, casting long shadows against the industrial factory buildings dotting the outskirts of town. The drive from Albuquerque had been long, but the tip they received mere hours earlier had made every mile worth it. James Carter, the drifter they had been chasing for months, had finally surfaced. A concerned citizen had called in, recognizing his face from a news broadcast, and reporting that he was working in a small manufacturing plant on the edge of town. Rachel pulled her car into a gravel lot next to the factory, her unmarked sedan blending easily with the line of vehicles parked outside. She glanced at her partner, Officer Torres, who had barely slept during the drive, much like her. His usual chipper demeanor was replaced with a quiet intensity. "This feels like it, doesn't it?" Torres said, breaking the heavy silence between them. "Feels like it," Rachel confirmed, her tone calm but loaded with tension. 6 months of digging through clues, interviews, financial records, hell, even motel floorboards. And he ends up in Houston. Let's just hope he doesn't bolt before we get inside. Torres checked his sidearm and nodded. What do we know about this place? Rachel thumbed through the report that had been printed during their pit stop. Small factory that processes metal parts. Random labor gigs, half paid in cash. Looks like James slipped through the back door of another short-term job. Standard stuff for him. No questions asked, no paperwork filed. The manager said he hired a guy who introduced himself as John Carpenter, but the description matches James to a T. Yeah, well, John Carpenter might be his worst fake name yet. Torres smirked faintly. Rachel allowed herself a dry chuckle. We're lucky he's lazy with his aliases. All right, we've got local HPD units in position. Let's move in quietly, see if we can pick him up without a scene. Rachel and Torres slipped into the factory through its east entrance, where a Houston Police Department patrol officer met them in the dimly lit hallway. The officer, a young woman with sharp eyes, updated them quickly. We've ID'd the suspect on the floor, the officer said in a low tone. He's working one of the presses near the north side. No indication he's armed, but he's been acting nervous since he clocked in. Rachel nodded, her jaw tightening. That nervousness could work to our advantage, or it could make him unpredictable. Let's assume he doesn't come quietly. Got it, the officer said, stepping aside as Rachel and Torres moved further in. The main factory floor was a cacophony of noise, machines grinding and hissing, the metallic clang of steel on steel, and the faint hum of overhead lights flickering unevenly. Workers in dusty jumpsuits moved briskly between stations, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. To the casual observer it looked like another day on the job, but Rachel's eyes were locked onto one figure near the far corner of the room. That's him, Torres whispered, his tone low but confident. The guy on the press. Rachel followed Torres's gaze. Sure enough, there he was. James Carter, or John Carpenter, as he'd been calling himself here. He looked thinner than his photos, his face haggard and pale under the flickering lights. His movements were mechanical, almost anxious as he operated the press, his eyes darting toward the exit every few seconds. He knows, Rachel murmured, watching his body language. He knows something's coming. We taking him here or waiting until he steps outside? Torres asked, his hand brushing against his holstered weapon. Here, Rachel decided. If we let him out of our sight, he might pull another Houdini. Let's do it quick and smart. Surround him. Torres signaled to the HPD officers positioned throughout the floor. Within seconds, they moved into place, spreading out to cut off any potential exit routes. Torres and Rachel approached James cautiously, their boots crunching against the gritty concrete floor. James Carter! Rachel called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Every head on the factory floor turned, except his. James froze, his hands still gripping the lever of the press. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes wide and panicked as they locked onto Rachel and Torres. For a moment it looked like he might make a run for it. His foot shifted slightly, testing the ground beneath him. Don't, Rachel warned, her tone firm but measured. You take one step, and this gets worse for you. James's jaw twitched, his hands trembling as he raised them slightly into the air. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his voice shaking. You've got the wrong guy. Save it, Torres shot back, his voice colder than Rachel had ever heard. You've been running for months, James. It ends here. James's eyes darted to the exits, scanning the officers blocking his way. I didn't do anything, he insisted, sweat now dripping down his temple. His voice cracked under the weight of his own panic. Whatever you think I did, it wasn't me, I swear. Rachel stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. You can tell us your side of the story back at the station. Hands behind your head now. For a moment it seemed like James might resist. His breathing quickened, his shoulders tensed, and Rachel could see the gears turning in his head, calculating his chances of escape. But when Torres shifted slightly, his hand hovering near his holster, James seemed to collapse into himself. All right, he yelled, his voice breaking. He lowered himself slowly to his knees, his hands trembling as they rose behind his head. Just don't shoot me, all right? Torres moved in, securing James's hands with a crisp click of handcuffs. The factory floor was silent now, the workers watching with stunned expressions as the officers led James out. Rachel followed close behind, her mind already racing ahead to the next steps. The chase might be over, but the real work was just beginning. As they reached the patrol car waiting outside, Rachel paused, turning to face James. He was hunched over, his wrists cuffed tightly behind his back, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Anything you want to say before we get started? Rachel asked, her voice calm but probing. James glanced up at her, his eyes hollow. I didn't have a choice, he muttered, barely audible. Rachel's brow furrowed. A choice about what, James? But he didn't answer. His head dropped again, his gaze fixed on the gravel beneath his feet. Rachel exchanged a glance with Torres, whose expression mirrored her own mixture of frustration and intrigue. As the car doors closed and James was driven away, Rachel stood in the lot, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. "This isn't over yet," she muttered to herself. The arrest was just the beginning. There were still countless questions to be answered, stories to piece together, and crimes to charge. But one thing was certain. James Carter no longer had anywhere to run. James's confession. The interrogation room was cold, almost purposely so. Its sterile walls reflected the harsh white light from above, illuminating James Carter's gaunt face as he sat slumped in the metal chair. His cuffed hands rested motionless on the scratched-up table, his gaze fixed on a spot just beyond its edge. For all his running, all his schemes, James looked like a man utterly defeated, a balloon deflated after months of pressure. Detective Rachel Moore watched him from the other side of the two-way mirror, her arms crossed. Next to her, Officer Torres fidgeted impatiently, bouncing on the balls of his feet. "How long are we going to let him sit there like that?" Torres asked, glancing at Rachel. "As long as it takes," Rachel said, her voice calm but sharp. "The walls are already closing in on him, Torres. He knows it's over. I just want him to stew for a little while longer. Let the weight of it sink in." Torres huffed. "He's got to know we have him nailed, right? I mean, there's no way he thinks he can talk his way out of this." Rachel's lips curved into a small, grim smile. "That's the thing about guys like James. Deep down they're scared of being confronted, of being caught, and especially of having to face the truth about themselves. He'll talk. They always do." Torres gave a slight nod, tapping his fingers lightly on the frame of the glass. "You sure you don't want me in there with you?" "Not this time," Rachel said. "He's been running from this moment for months. He doesn't need two people in his face. We'd just spook him. No, this one's about control. Besides," she added, turning toward the door, "he needs to feel like he's being heard, and trust me, I'm really good at listening." When Rachel walked into the room, James didn't flinch, but his shoulders stiffened just slightly. He didn't look up, not until Rachel pulled the chair back and sat down across from him. She slid a manila folder onto the table, its contents perfectly organized but deliberately left unopened, for now. "James," she began, her voice measured and calm. "You're in deep, you know that, right?" James's fingers twitched in his lap, but he didn't respond. Rachel leaned forward slightly, resting her clasped hands on the table. "I'd ask how you're holding up, but I'm guessing the answer's pretty obvious. You've been running for, what, months now? Probably feels like years, though, doesn't it?" Still nothing. "You can sit there in silence if you want, doesn't bother me," Rachel continued casually. "I've got all night, James, and so do you." Finally, James shifted in his seat, his tired eyes flicking up to meet hers for the briefest moment. "What do you want me to say?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I don't want you to say anything," Rachel said, "but I think you need to say something. You've been carrying this weight for a long time. Guilt doesn't stay quiet forever. It eats away at you, doesn't it?" That struck a nerve. James exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "You don't understand," he muttered. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "So, help me understand, James. Tell me what happened." "You wouldn't get it," he said, his voice rising slightly. There was anger there, but it was thin, like a mask plastered over something deeper. "You think I'm some kind of monster, don't you? Like I just woke up one day and decided to do this?" Rachel gave him a look that was neither judgmental nor sympathetic. "Honestly, I don't think it was that simple. I think it built up over time, didn't it? Pressure, resentment, anger, it all piles up until it has to go somewhere." James dragged his hands down his face, groaning into his palms. "You don't know what it's like," he said through gritted teeth. "My whole life he looked down on me, always made me feel like I was nothing, like I couldn't take care of myself. Just because he screwed up his life doesn't mean I was supposed to fix it." Rachel nodded subtly, encouraging him to keep going. "You mean your father, Robert?" James's jaw twitched at the name. "Yeah, him. He always acted like he was doing me a favor, but it wasn't help. It was control. Every time I asked him for something, he'd hold it over my head, like I owed him, you know?" "That must have been frustrating," Rachel said, her voice softening as she leaned forward. "Feeling like every time you tried to get ahead he was holding you back." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Frustrating doesn't cover it. It was, I don't know, it was like he wanted me to fail. Like he needed me to stay small so he could feel better about all the crap he screwed up in his own life." "So what happened the night it finally boiled over?" Rachel asked. Her tone didn't change, it was patient, deliberate. What did he say to push you that far?" James fell silent for a moment, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He said I was worthless, a waste of space, that even Anna thought so." "Anna Lee," Rachel clarified carefully. "She was living with him, right?" James nodded, his expression tightening. "She always took his side. Even when I called him out on his crap, she'd jump in like I was the bad guy. She didn't understand what he was really like." Rachel paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. "And that night? It got out of control," James said, his voice cracking. "We were yelling. He said I was a failure, told me I'd never be anything, and I lost it, okay? I just lost it." "What happened, James?" Rachel pressed gently. James's eyes filled with tears, his voice breaking as the words tumbled out. "I hit him. I didn't mean to kill him, God, I didn't, but once it happened, I panicked. And Anna, she came in and saw, and she started screaming. I didn't know what to do." Rachel's heart sank, though her face remained composed. "So you went after Anna too?" "She wouldn't stop," James choked out. "I didn't have a choice. She was gonna call the cops. You don't get it. I was dead either way." Rachel sat in silence for a moment, letting his confession wash over her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but firm. "And the concrete, the molds, the mixer, who taught you how to do all of that?" James let out another bitter laugh. "Nobody. I saw it in some stupid crime show. I thought if I could just make them disappear, it'd all go away. But it didn't. It never did." "No," Rachel said quietly. "It doesn't." For a long moment the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. James sat hunched over, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the weight of his confession settling heavily in the air. When she finally stood to leave, she paused by the door, turning back to face him. "James," she said, her voice softer than before, "you didn't just bury their bodies under concrete. You buried yourself there too. And now, it's time to face what's left." James didn't respond. He just sat there, a broken man, knowing his story was over. Motivations behind the crime, and the gruesome cover-up. The conversation between Detective Rachel Moore and Officer Torres lingered in the chilly precinct conference room as they pieced together James Carter's disturbing motive. On the table lay a collage of evidence, crime scene photos, copies of James's confession, and forensic reports. Each scrap of paper and photograph was another fragment of the same haunting narrative. A man consumed by resentment, abandonment, and twisted ingenuity. Rachel rubbed her temples as Torres leaned back in his chair, chewing on the edges of a pen cap. "You know," he said, "this whole thing with James, motivations, methods, it's not just some spur-of-the-moment crime. This crap is layered, like one of those horror stories where the guy loses his mind slowly, bit by bit." Rachel nodded but didn't look up. Instead, she stared at the photo of the concrete blocks that had been extracted from beneath the Garrison Avenue Bridge, their jagged surfaces like gravestones for secrets never meant to be uncovered. "To pull something like this off," she murmured half to herself, "that takes time, planning, and not just planning. It takes commitment to something dark. You don't get here on impulse." Torres tossed the pen onto the table. "So what's your theory? What finally pushed him over the edge?" Rachel straightened in her seat, tapping the stack of notes in front of her. "This wasn't about sudden rage or losing control. This was about power, finding it, taking it back, and burying everything else behind him. A lifetime of resentment." Torres raised an eyebrow. "You don't think it was just about the money?" Rachel shook her head. "The debt was the catalyst, not the cause. It gave him a tangible thing to focus all his anger on, something he could name, measure, and blame." She flipped through her notes, pulling out segments of James's confession. "We know he felt marginalized, humiliated. To him, his father Robert wasn't just a flawed man, he was a force holding him down, and Anna, according to James, was complicit in that." "Complicit how?" Torres asked. "By siding with Robert," Rachel replied simply. Her tone was matter-of-fact but heavy. "Think about this from James's perspective. He sees himself as a failure, can't hold a job for more than a few months, drowning in debt, hopping from place to place. He's angry, and that anger needs a target. Robert becomes that target because, to James, his father represents every dead end he's ever hit. And Anna, she's the reminder, the witness. Every side comment or disapproving look from her reinforces this twisted idea in James's head, that they're a team against him." Torres leaned forward, arms resting on the table. "All right, I can buy that. But that's a long way to go from justifiable anger to this," he said, gesturing toward the crime scene photos. Rachel tapped a report from the makings of James's workshop in the basement of the house. It was filled with chilling details about the materials found there: concrete mixers, wooden molds, and scattered remnants of Portland cement. "That's where the power comes in," Rachel said. "For James, this wasn't just about silencing them. It was about control, crafting the narrative, creating their literal tombs with his bare hands." The methodical cover-up. "If it was all about some power trip," Torres said, frowning, "then explain why he thought he could get away with this for so long. You'd think someone so desperate would be too sloppy to pull a stunt like this." Rachel smirked faintly. "He was sloppy. For every calculated step, James left behind evidence that we used to track him: aliases, receipts, witness statements. He was careful, but not flawless." Torres gestured toward the forensic reports. "Careful? He turned his kitchen into a construction site. Who even thinks to do that?" Rachel pulled out one of the photographs taken from the kitchen. The rusty mixer stood like a macabre centerpiece, its edges still caked in hardened stains. Nearby, the stack of wooden planks James had used as molds now sat in evidence bags back at the lab. This was all about controlling the aftermath. James didn't just want to hide the bodies. He wanted to make them disappear completely, reduced to just objects. The concrete wasn't just about disposal, it was a way to rewrite the narrative. Turn them into nothing more than a problem he fixed. "But why concrete?" Torres asked, leaning back again. "What makes someone think to do that?" "He told us, remember?" Rachel replied, her voice laced with an edge of disbelief. The absurdity still hadn't faded, even after hearing it straight from James's mouth. He got the idea from some crime show he'd seen, probably thought it was foolproof. Encased the bodies in something so strong that even if someone stumbled upon them, they wouldn't be able to figure out what was inside. Torres grimaced. And he was almost right. If that sanitation worker hadn't taken a crowbar to one of those blocks, "It would have worked," Rachel said, finishing his thought, "at least for a while. But James underestimated the process. Concrete can hide a lot, but it's not perfect. There are flaws. Air bubbles, changes in texture, traces in the materials, and the smell. There's no escaping the smell." The psychology behind the chaos. "It's like he turned himself into a craftsman of death," Torres said after a long pause. "The more we dig, the more it feels like he cared about the process as much as the outcome." Rachel nodded. "It gave him control. Building those blocks wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. He didn't see himself as just hiding Robert and Anna. He was erasing all the pain, the rage, the humiliation he associated with them. As long as they were encased in concrete, they couldn't hurt him anymore. Or so he thought." Torres shook his head, his expression grim. "Sick way of thinking. You gotta wonder, when does someone cross that line? When does anger become something like this?" Rachel had no answers for that. Instead, she stared at the collage of evidence, her mind unwillingly imagining James down in the basement, his hands coated in dust and sweat as he worked tirelessly to mix concrete, pound nails into the molds, and pour layer after layer over the bodies of the two people who had most defined his life. "It doesn't happen overnight," she said finally, her voice low. "It festers, and for James, it festered for years." The final mistake. "But no matter how meticulous," Rachel continued, "he made mistakes, sloppy ones, and every single one brought us here." "The tools he left behind," Torres said, counting on his fingers. "The receipts, the weird questions at job sites." "And the motel manager," Rachel added. "If he just kept quiet, not vented about hiding something, who knows how long it would have taken us." Torres sighed deeply, crossing his arms. "So, what do we call this? A guy losing his grip on reality? Or someone who knew exactly what the hell he was doing?" Rachel looked up from the reports, her gray eyes sharp and unwavering. "Both," she said. "James Carter wasn't insane, he was desperate. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He planned every detail, obsessed over every step. He thought he could bury the evidence, his past, and his guilt all in one move." "And the concrete," Torres muttered, staring blankly at a photo of one of the blocks. Rachel allowed herself a faint smirk, though there was no humor behind it. "Yeah, the concrete." As Rachel leaned back in her chair, tracing a finger along the edges of the crime scene photos, she let out a slow, measured breath. "He thought he was building graves for his victims, but really, Torres, he was building a monument to his own failure." "Can't bury the truth forever," Torres replied, standing and tossing his coffee cup into the trash. "It always finds its way out." The verdict and conclusion of the case. The courtroom's quiet was palpable, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. The dim morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting streaks of golden gray across the polished oak benches. It was December 14th, 2023, the final day of the trial that had captured national attention for its gruesome details and chilling exploration of human darkness. James Carter, the man who had evaded justice for months before being captured, now sat hunched at the defendant's table. His face was pale, drawn, with hollow eyes that lingered on the table in front of him. He hadn't looked up since the judge entered the room. Detective Rachel Moore watched him carefully from her seat near the prosecutor's table. She had been at the trial every day, a quiet but constant presence, her sharp gray eyes catching every shift in the room like a hawk. Next to her, Officer Torres adjusted his tie, an unusually somber expression on his face. "You think he even cares what happens?" Torres whispered, leaning slightly toward Rachel. Rachel stayed silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on James. "He cares," she said softly, "just not in the way you think. He's not afraid of the verdict. He's afraid of what comes after. He knows there's no hiding anymore, no running." Torres let out a slow breath, nodding. "The guy has a special kind of arrogance, doesn't he? Even sitting there he looks like he's rehearsing excuses in his head." Rachel smirked faintly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "He used to run the show in his own warped mind. Now the entire world is watching. That's what he can't stand." The judge, a commanding woman with a stern expression and sharp glasses perched on her nose, called for the courtroom to rise as the jury filed back into their seats. Each juror moved carefully, their faces unreadable, though the weight of the decision they carried seemed to press against the room's air. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Matthews," the bailiff announced. Once everyone was seated again, Judge Matthews turned her attention to the foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged man in a navy suit who held a single piece of paper in trembling hands. "Mr. Foreman," Judge Matthews said, her tone steady but firm, "have you reached a verdict?" The man cleared his throat nervously. "We have, Your Honor." Rachel sat up straighter, her hands clasping tightly on her lap. Torres leaned forward slightly, his jaw tight. Across the aisle James remained motionless, the faintest hint of his pulse visible in his neck. "In the matter of the state versus James Carter on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Robert Carter," the foreman began, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom, an exhale from the gallery, muffled sobs from Annalee's family seated near the front. James blinked once but didn't move. Rachel exchanged a brief glance with Torres. It wasn't relief exactly, it was more like affirmation, the grim satisfaction of justice served. The foreman continued, his voice steadying as he read the next counts. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Annalee, guilty. On the charge of tampering with evidence and improper disposal of human remains, guilty." The list went on. Burglary, obstruction of justice, and more, each verdict a nail in the coffin of James Carter's fragile defenses. When the final words left the foreman's lips, Judge Matthews gave a small nod and glanced at James. "The court thanks the jury for your service. We will reconvene tomorrow for sentencing," she announced before tapping her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The room burst into murmurs as soon as the gavel fell. Reporters rushed to grab statements from family members. Lawyers gathered their papers. Rachel stood slowly, her gaze locked on James, who remained seated, his hands clenched atop the table. "You think he'll fight the sentence?" Torres asked quietly as they stepped aside to let the lawyers pass by. Rachel shook her head. "What's left for him to fight? He's already trapped in it. Everything he ever tried to bury has risen right up to meet him. And now," she added, glancing toward the far side of the courtroom, "he's got nowhere else to run." The following day, when the courtroom reconvened for sentencing, the tension was even thicker than before. Judge Matthews's face was unreadable as she addressed the room. "James Carter has been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple secondary charges. The court recognizes the gravity of these crimes and the profound impact they've had on the lives of the victims' families and the community." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the judge continued. "Mr. Carter," Judge Matthews said, her gaze sharp as a knife, "you committed these acts with premeditation and an appalling disregard for human life. You attempted to erase your victims, not just physically but symbolically, hiding their remains beneath concrete in a calculated attempt to avoid accountability. Your actions were neither impulsive nor desperate, they were calculated, deliberate. Therefore this court has no hesitation in delivering the maximum sentence allowed by law." Rachel watched James's reaction, or lack of one, as the judge handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a moment James looked almost relieved, as though the weight of the chase had finally lifted. But Rachel knew better. The weight he carried wasn't lifted. It was just beginning to crush him. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, cameras flashing and microphones thrust into the faces of the prosecution team and family members. Rachel and Torres stayed back, leaning against the side of a squad car as they watched the scene unfold. "Well," Torres said after a beat, tossing his coat over one shoulder. "Guess we can finally close the book on this one, justice served and all that." "Justice, yes," Rachel said quietly, her gaze lingering on the doors of the courthouse. "But closure? That's harder to come by." Torres frowned. "You don't think the families feel some kind of peace knowing he'll rot in there forever?" Rachel sighed, crossing her arms. "Maybe, but losing someone like that, it leaves a hole that doesn't just go away. Even with him behind bars forever, they'll live with this. They'll live with the knowledge of how their loved ones died, of what he did to them." She glanced at Torres. "Justice isn't the same thing as peace." "Fair point," Torres said, his voice softening. He stood in silence for a moment before adding, "At least we made sure he can't do it again. That counts for something, right?" Rachel finally allowed herself a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It counts for a lot." As the reporters shifted their focus elsewhere and the courthouse steps began to empty, Rachel and Torres got into their car and pulled away from the scene. The city moved on around them, cars speeding by, people walking with purpose, oblivious to the darkness that had been uncovered over the last 6 months. In the passenger seat, Torres leaned back and exhaled. "So, what's next, detective?" Rachel smirked faintly, her hands steady on the wheel. "Another case, another day, but first maybe coffee that doesn't taste like chalk." Torres chuckled, and for the first time in months the heaviness felt a little lighter. As they drove off, Rachel let her mind wander briefly, just enough to remind herself that no matter how much darkness they faced, there was no running from the truth. Justice always found a way,